High above the Kidron Valley, halfway between Bethlehem and the Dead Sea, lies the ancient Mar Saba Monastery. Founded in 483 AD and dedicated to Saint Sabas the Sanctified, this monastery stands as one of the longest continuously inhabited monasteries in the world. In 1958, a groundbreaking find was uncovered here. The discovery was so scandalous that many dismissed it as a hoax. Yet after 60 years, the debate is far from settled. This is the story of the secret Gospel of Mark. In 1958, Morton Smith was granted access to Mar Saba to investigate and catalog its old, neglected books and manuscripts. As a rising scholar in biblical studies, Smith had a passion for sifting through dusty volumes in search of forgotten treasures.
I was chiefly interested in the uncatalogued manuscripts in the monastery's libraries, of which the chief one was on the top of the tower that dominates the monastery. It was there I made my discovery.
On all days except Sunday, accompanied by an escort, Smith journeyed to the tower library to examine old books and manuscripts. Eventually, he found handwritten Greek on the end pages of a 17th century printed edition of the works of Ignatius of Antioch. The title of the full text identifies it as a letter written by the early church father Clement of Alexandria, active in the final years of the 2nd century. In the letter, Clement asserts that Mark the Evangelist had penned an additional version of his gospel with special teachings. There would have been no reason to suspect anything unusual, for Smith had already discovered many such marginal texts. Evidently, the monastery had been short on paper. Smith, however, struggled to understand the challenging 18th century Greek handwriting. Like he had done before with several other books, he took it back to his room for a closer inspection. Before leaving, he took 3 sets of black and white photographs. After leaving the monastery, he meticulously translated the text from the photographs. After completing his initial translation, he surely must have realized how unusual its contents were. If proven genuine, it could challenge and reshape deeply entrenched beliefs about Jesus and his teachings. The letter's central claim, found nowhere else, was arresting. The Gospel of Mark, as recognized in modern times, was written as a revised version of a more complex and mysterious original gospel. In the letter, Clement asserts that Mark the Evangelist had penned an additional version of his gospel with special teachings. However, realizing its potential sensitivity, or perhaps its depth for the uninitiated, Mark, according to Clement in the letter, chose to produce a revised edition. This newer version eliminated sensitive or confusing material, making it more palatable or accessible to a broader audience. The letter itself is a denunciation of the beliefs and actions done by the Carpocratians, a Gnostic sect known for their libertine practices and reinterpretation of Christian doctrines. Clement describes them as heretics who are distorting Christian teachings with their carnal interpretations. Their founder and leader, Carpocrates, tricked a church leader in Alexandria into giving him a copy of the hidden version of the Gospel of Mark. The Carpocratians then changed this sacred text by adding their own false and offensive ideas to it. Clement is keen to set the record straight, having access to the original version himself. To show that the Carpocratians have deceitfully added to the secret text, Clement gives 2 short quotations from his version. Quote, "And a certain woman whose brother had died was there, and coming, she prostrated herself before Jesus and said to him, 'Son of David, have mercy on me.' But the disciples rebuked her, and Jesus, being angered, went off with her into the garden where the tomb was, and straightway, going in where the youth was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand. But the youth, looking upon him, loved him, and began to beseech him that he might be with him. And going out of the tomb, they came into the house of the youth, for he was rich. And after 6 days, Jesus told him what to do, and in the evening the youth came to him, wearing a linen cloth over his naked body. And he remained with him that night, for Jesus taught him the mystery of the kingdom of God. And thence arising, he returned to the other side of the Jordan." Unquote. This strange quotation invites numerous questions. What was occurring during the nighttime scene? Why does he approach Jesus draped only in a linen cloth over his naked body? Why does Jesus ask the boy to do this? Who is the youth? The passage possibly hints at more than mere teaching happening between Jesus and the unnamed youth. Such interpretations contribute to debates about homosexuality within the text. Interestingly, Clement himself does not seem to hold any homosexual interpretations. From the context of the letter, we can infer that Clement has been asked if the secret gospel contains the phrases "naked man with naked man" and other things. To allay these concerns, he says, quote, "But naked man with naked man, and the other things about which you wrote, are not found." And after the words, "and he comes into Jericho," the secret gospel adds only, "and the sister of the young man who Jesus loved was there, along with his mother and Salome. But Jesus did not receive them. But many other things about which you wrote both seem to be and are falsifications." Unquote. After these quotations, Clement continues to explain the aforementioned story. Quote, "Now the true interpretation, also the one that agrees with the true philosophy." Unquote. Here our copy of Clement's letter abruptly concludes, leaving us to wonder what the true interpretation is supposed to be. If this represents just one of Mark the Evangelist's esoteric teachings, what could the others have been? Now, what happened to the manuscript? Upon its discovery at Mar Saba, Morton Smith took 3 sets of black and white photographs. 2 years later, in 1960, he introduced his scientific discovery to the world. In 1973, he published 2 books, including cropped reprints of his black and white photographs. In 1976, a group of scholars, including David Flusser and Guy Strumsa, visit Mar Saba to inspect the manuscript and decide to move it to the Patriarchate Library in Jerusalem for safekeeping. In 1977, librarian Father Callistos Dervos clumsily rips out the additional pages containing the secret gospel. This was done to catalog the letter and the printed book separately. However, even after 13 years to do so, Dervos has stated that he never cataloged them. In 1980, Thomas Talley visits the Patriarchate Library to study the manuscript, but finds it separate from the Voss edition and under repair, not available for viewing. In 1983, Quentin Quesnel sees the manuscript in the Patriarchate Library and takes high-quality color photographs. In these pictures, we can observe the careless manner in which Dervos removed the pages. Afterwards, Dervos refused all access to the manuscript up until his retirement in 1990. The manuscript has since gone missing and has not been seen since. This has left speculation that these pages were deliberately destroyed or concealed by parties keen on shielding the content from the public eye. Perhaps Father Dervos was unhappy about the attention received by the manuscript and hid or destroyed the remains. When Quentin Quesnel saw the manuscript for the final time in 1983, he reports that Dervos, quote, does not want others to come, and that he, quote, shudders any time I suggest more people coming. Father Callistos Dervos died in 2016. So, if genuine, how did the secret gospel make its way down to us? Let's consider the line of transmission necessary for authenticity. Sometime in the 1st century AD, the secret gospel and its shorter, redacted version are produced. By the late 2nd century, a copy of the secret version makes its way to Clement of Alexandria. Clement writes a letter in response to inquiries from a certain Theodore about a version of Mark's Gospel that the Carpocratians were using. Clement refutes their interpretations and practices by quoting the secret Gospel of Mark as evidence. This letter then must have been copied by monks repeatedly over the next 1,000 years. In the 18th century, a copy is transcribed onto the end pages of a book containing the works of Ignatius of Antioch, probably done at or near the Mar Saba Monastery. Perhaps the original copy was damaged when a collection of manuscripts held in a Mar Saba cave went up in flames. This or something else might explain why we do not have the letter in its entirety. Finally, in 1958, Morton Smith discovers the manuscript and photographs it. There are several critical junctions in this line of transmission where potential forgeries may exist. For instance, the referenced secret gospel might have ancient origins, but not be an unredacted version of the Gospel of Mark. Clement may indeed be the author of the letter, yet the quotations from secret Mark could be his fabrications. Alternatively, the letter by Clement could itself be a forgery, concocted sometime between the 2nd and 18th centuries. Lastly, the possibility remains that Morton Smith forged this otherwise unknown copy of Clement's letter and inscribed the Greek text into the end pages of a book he borrowed at Mar Saba. If secret Mark is really an expanded version of canonical Mark, then we would expect to find evident similarities in their writing styles. Let's consider whether these quotations from secret Mark are consistent with the style of Mark. The Gospel of Mark emphasizes Jesus' miraculous deeds over his teachings. The Greek used in Mark is less refined compared to other Gospels, featuring awkward syntax and simpler vocabulary. Mark's style includes redundant phrases and excessive rhetoric, traits often smoothed out in Matthew and Luke. Mark frequently uses the historical past tense, starting sentences with verbs to create immediacy and urgency. Our quotations from secret Mark seem to reflect this. Jesus is very direct and unhesitating in his actions, and the significance of the events described are not explained. Mark's Gospel is also characterized by a theme of secrecy. Jesus often instructs his disciples and beneficiaries of miracles to keep his identity and powers concealed, a theme known as the Messianic secret. This stands in contrast to the Gospel of John, where Jesus openly declares himself to be the Son of God. In Mark, when Jesus' disciple Peter guesses Jesus to be the Messiah, he is rebuked and told to keep it a secret. This may explain the secretive nature of Jesus' activities in the secret gospel. When the sister of the dead youth beseeches Jesus to help, she angers Jesus and is rebuked by the disciples. We might expect Jesus to show compassion. However, this sort of unexpected reaction can be found in canonical Mark. In Mark chapter 1, verse 41, a leper asks to be healed by Jesus. In most translations and Greek manuscripts, Jesus is, quote, moved with compassion, unquote. However, in many of the oldest and best manuscripts, like the Codex Bezae from circa 400 AD, Jesus is angered. The exact original wording is unknown. However, most scholars believe that Mark originally had an angry Jesus here. This agrees well with his behavior in our quotations of secret Mark. Why he is angered, of course, is nowhere explained. For instance, the canonical Gospel of Mark exhibits textual inconsistencies and abrupt narrative shifts, which could be elegantly resolved with additions from secret Mark. Specifically, in one verse, we observe Jesus entering Jericho, yet intriguingly, in the very next sentence of the same verse, he is depicted as leaving the city. In Mark chapter 10, verse 46, the text initially states, quote, "Then they came to Jericho." However, the next sentence, which introduces the miracle of blind Bartimaeus receiving his sight, indicates that they were, quote, "leaving the city." This is odd, as it's typical for Mark to incorporate descriptions of significant occurrences in the areas Jesus visits prior to his departure. This anomaly in canonical Mark supports the idea that sections of Mark's Gospel have been clumsily redacted or removed. In the Gospel of Mark, there is a brief but intriguing episode that occurs right at the moment of Jesus' arrest. This passage describes a young man wearing nothing but a linen cloth who manages to escape the Roman guards by shedding his apparel and fleeing naked. Quote, "And there followed him a certain young man, having a linen cloth cast about his naked body. And the young men laid hold on him, and he left the linen cloth and fled from them naked." Unquote. This character, mentioned nowhere else in the New Testament, has puzzled both modern and ancient interpreters of the Bible. Matthew and Luke both copy Mark word for word when describing the events surrounding Jesus' arrest. However, they have both chosen to remove the two verses in which the naked youth are found. The authors of Matthew and Luke may have been unaware of this story's significance. Scholars and theologians have long debated the possible identity of the youth. Some think that he is the early Christian leader James the Just, who is also the brother of Jesus. Others believe that he is the beloved disciple, often identified as John, one of the 12 apostles. He may be John Mark, the man traditionally credited with composing Mark's Gospel. He was a companion of Paul and Peter during the events after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Perhaps this story is an autobiographical addition. However, we must consider that most scholars no longer believe that the canonical Gospel attributed to Mark was actually written by this figure. The youth may be Lazarus of Bethany, a character who shares many commonalities with the youth from Secret Mark. In the Gospel of John, he is raised from the dead, much like the youth in Secret Mark. Is it possible that the naked youths from Secret Mark and canonical Mark are the same? In the New Testament, we find 3 stories of Jesus resurrecting individuals. Of these, the resurrection story from Secret Mark is remarkably similar to the raising of Lazarus in the Gospel of John. The following are the shared characteristics of both stories, not found with the other 2 resurrections. In both stories, the subject is resurrected several days after death. Both take place in Bethany. In both stories, the sister of the deceased person speaks to Jesus before the resurrection. In both stories, the family of the deceased seems to be very wealthy. In both stories, Jesus has an interaction or relationship with the resurrected individual after the resurrection. In both stories, one of the participants is said to love the other. In Secret Mark, the youth loves Jesus, and in John, Jesus loves Lazarus. Jesus' emotions become heightened in both stories, although admittedly in different ways. Before the resurrection of Lazarus, Jesus cries, but in the Secret Gospel of Mark, he is angered. Despite these similarities, the stories are quite different from each other. Mark's imperative style is apparent in the Secret Gospel. Instead of solemnly commanding from a distance, Jesus, quote, "Straightway going in where the youth was, he stretched forth his hand and raised him, seizing his hand," unquote. Perhaps the 2 stories have a common source. The letter attributed to Clement either represents a genuine work or a deliberate imitation, aligning too closely with Clement's style to be an accidental misattribution. Its uniformity and cohesiveness rule out modification through simple interpolation, the letter extensively uses Clement's vocabulary, phraseology, and metaphors without directly copying his exact words. Additionally, the letter features significant use of syntactic expressions typical of Clement, with complex sentence structures. However, the letter's disproportionate use of rare words, known as hapax legomena, words that appear only once in a given context, raises suspicion. These words occur far more frequently in the letter than in Clement's genuine writings. This suggests an overdone attempt to replicate Clement's unique vocabulary. Morton Smith could have deliberately used these words and obtained them from a published 1936 list of Clementine vocabulary to aid him in his crafting of the document. Some scholars argue for the letter's authenticity due to its close adherence to Clement's linguistic and stylistic features, believing that the intricate alignment with his known works is too sophisticated to be a forgery. Others, however, see the letter as more Clement than Clement ever was, suggesting an exaggerated imitation. The matter remains unresolved. It has been argued that the monks at Mar Saba forged the secret Gospel of Mark to legitimize same-sex monastic partnerships, known as adelphopoiesis, or brother-making. This practice involved two monks developing a strong emotional bond and vowing to bind themselves together, often cohabitating. This controversial practice was not universally accepted, and the secret gospel may have been created to argue that Jesus himself legitimized these relationships. The secret gospel's ambiguous language could be interpreted as referring to intimate bonds, such as the passage describing a youth coming to Jesus at night, wearing only a linen cloth over his naked body. However, it is crucial to note that not all adelphopoiesis relationships were sexual. In this context, the secret gospel can also serve as a cautionary tale against sexualization of these relationships. The letter criticizes the Carpocratians for corrupting the secret gospel with salacious passages. Its explicit denial of phrases like naked man with naked man further emphasizes the purity of these relationships. In this way, the forger sought to justify the same-sex bonds, while distancing them from accusations of sexual intent. In fabricating the letter, the monks likely viewed their act as revealing a hidden truth about spiritual companionship, rather than committing forgery. Historical events and monastic practices provide a plausible explanation for how the manuscript ended up incomplete and copied onto the end pages of another book. In the early 18th century, a significant fire ravaged a cave at the Mar Saba Monastery, where many ancient manuscripts were stored. According to monastic tradition, the fire smoldered for 2 weeks. This fire is believed to have destroyed or severely damaged a collection of Clement's letters, possibly including the Mar Saba letter. Despite the devastation, it's presumed that many manuscripts survived the fire in a fragmentary state. Unlike normal exposed fires, a limited air supply in the cave may have resulted in incomplete combustion. Typically, the edges of books will char in such a fire, leaving the centers relatively undamaged. As a result, many loose leaves and fragments from various manuscripts were preserved. These fragments were often found isolated or reused in other manuscripts, or even in bookbinding. Such fragments were documented during a visit made by Papadopoulos Karameus. Perhaps it was around this time that a monk took an interest into the Clementine fragment. Lacking any sheets of paper, the monk utilized the blank pages at the end of a printed book. If the original manuscript fragment was already damaged, it may explain why our version ends so abruptly. The original fragment may have deteriorated or been discarded Another well-known example of this practice of manuscript reuse is the Archimedes palimpsest. The manuscript contains 2 works of Archimedes that were thought to have been lost. In 1229, a Mar Saba monk scraped and washed away the original text and overwrote it with a Christian liturgical text. The original text was not revealed until modern imaging technologies were applied. Geoffrey Smith and Brent Landau conducted a fresh paleographic analysis, contacting leading experts in late Greek cursive handwriting to get their thoughts on the handwriting. 4 experts analyzed the manuscript. Dr. Agapitos initially assigned the handwriting to the second half of the 18th century, drawing parallels to several similar manuscripts. However, after reviewing another expert's analysis, Agapitos revised his view, considering the manuscript to be a successful forgery. Dr. Landbers also dated the handwriting to the 18th century. He ruled out the possibility of a 20th century forgery, finding no unusual features in the handwriting for its alleged time. Contrastingly, Dr. Melisakis argued that while the script could indeed be a forgery, it was not of the 20th century. He posited the forgery could be from the early 19th century, thereby ruling out Morton Smith as a suspect. Dr. Zelikas, director of the Paleographic Institute in Athens, published an analysis suggesting that Smith may have worked with an accomplice to forge the manuscript. Despite this, he acknowledged some similarities of the handwriting with 18th century manuscripts. Evidently, there is a significant divergence among experts regarding the plausibility of a Morton Smith forgery. Proponents of the forgery hypothesis often cast suspicion on Morton Smith. During his time at Mar Saba, he was permitted to bring manuscripts and books back to his private room. What would have prevented him from forging the manuscripts?
Now, unfortunately, forgeries of ancient letters are common.
Proponents argue that Smith was a biblical scholar looking for just such an ancient text. However, there is also compelling evidence against his direct involvement in any forgery. Analysis of the handwriting and examples of Smith's Greek handwriting indicate that Smith probably lacked the skill and understanding needed to produce the Clement letter. Furthermore, Smith's documented difficulties in understanding the manuscript imply his genuine unfamiliarity with it. Several scholars have pointed out problems with his interpretation of the text. If Smith had forged the letter, perhaps it would be more consistent with his theories. The truth could easily be determined by testing the ink on the manuscript. Unfortunately, with the manuscript itself being gone, we must turn to examine Smith himself. Many have looked to Morton Smith's behavior and overall character as evidence that he forged the letter. In 1960, Morton Smith arranged a significant public announcement of his findings regarding the secret gospel. He sent presentations to major news outlets, ensuring that a summary would appear on the front page of the New York Times. During the symposium, Smith was protective of his findings, strictly limiting the quoting of the material he presented, claiming copyright restrictions. Smith displayed provocative humor, making off-color jokes during his presentation, such as suggesting that a priest caught with a nearly nude young man would be in trouble, and other quips likening his discoveries to modern scandalous headlines, which sometimes shocked his audience. Morton Smith was regarded as an eloquent and insightful scholar whose writings were not only knowledgeable, but occasionally playful. However, he was also known for his harsh critiques of other scholars, often insulting their work in print with remarks about their language skills. Smith often expressed disappointment with the academic community surrounding religious studies, critiquing it for attracting less competent individuals and taking pleasure in exposing their shortcomings. One must wonder if the Mar Saba letter was one such way in which Smith could expose their shortcomings by fooling them with such a forgery. Despite his outspoken nature in public, Smith was very private about his personal life. He never married, and arranged for most of his personal correspondences to be destroyed after his death. Those who knew Smith well generally did not suspect him of forgery, viewing him as deeply committed to historical truth. His personal and professional conduct, as observed in various aspects of his life, seemed to affirm his dedication to accurate historical research. Although Jacob Nusser, a contemporary and former mentee, accused Smith of forgery, it has been suggested that this accusation was more out of personal spite than evidence. Smith's wide array of character witnesses, from close associates, bolsters the defense against these accusations, suggesting that his love for the past was too great for him to tamper with historical documents. After Smith's death in 1991, his apartment was photographed. The images taken of his bedroom and pantry show us that Smith's home had been transformed into a veritable library. There is no doubt that Smith was a dedicated scholar, or at least really liked to read. Of all the various opinions and theories put forward to explain the secret gospel, this is what Smith himself had to say.
A few years after Jesus' death, we hear of his disciples baptizing converts in his name. But about baptism administered by Jesus himself, the Gospels say practically nothing. Why? There's a mystery here. Can it be that Jesus' baptismal ritual was the mystery? Perhaps the mystery of the kingdom of God. In that secret nocturnal initiation, Jesus may have given the initiates a hypnotic experience that would make them share his ascent to the kingdom of heaven and see him there in glory, talking with Elijah and Moses, just as the Gospels say they saw him. He was offering his disciples access to the kingdom of heaven, not in the far future, but right now.
So, what do you think? Did Morton Smith forge the secret Gospel of Mark? Or is it genuine? Let us know what you think down in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching. I hope to see you next time. If you like this content and would like to see more, like and subscribe.